right, welcome everybody to this week's edition of Trialogues. For those of you who have heard our podcast in the past, you're well acquainted with these gentlemen. But for those of you who are new to our discussion, let me take a minute and introduce everybody. We have our Englishman in New York, Matthew Shadbolt, who is the Director of Interactive Product and Marketing at the Corcoran Group. Hello, Matthew.
Hey, Lindsay. How's it going?
It's good. Glad to have you on this week, as every week. And we also have our Vermont resident, Gaylord DeWald, janitor and president of Thought Faucet. Hey, Gaylord.
How's it going, Lindsay?
That's good. And my fellow Houstonian, managing partner of 7DS Associates. Most of you guys know him as Notorious Rob from his blog, Rob Hahn. Hey, Rob.
Hey, how's it going?
That's good. All right, so you guys, we're going to jump in today. Matthew, you had some things that you wanted to share with us this week that we were talking about on the pre-call.
Yeah, it's something that Gaylord and I were thinking about, and we'd sort of discussed it a few weeks ago, which was this idea of how editorial and attention span is changing. And one of the things that got us talking about this in particular was something that we saw online that the New York Times did to do with a story about an avalanche. And it was a highly interactive, sort of multimedia kind of presentation of the story that allowed the reader to sort of be guided through the journey of reading about this particular thing that had happened on a mountain. And it sort of reminded me of like the old days of interactive CD-ROMs, where it was sort of fairly basic in terms of like user experience, but it created this sort of guided journey around a story. And Gaylord and I started to talk about this kind of stuff, and we thought it would be an interesting set of ideas to explore, potentially with reference to the real estate industry, because this idea of being guided through a story or being guided through a process, that's something that we talk a lot about in terms of the customer journey, or how non-linear the relationship between perhaps like a buyer and an agent can be as part of that home buying or selling process in sort of a 2 or 3 year funnel when people consider themselves to be in the market. So we wanted to sort of start with this idea of different forms of reading, and then perhaps, with Rob's assistance, sort of tie it together in terms of a real estate and home buying context. Did I get everything right there, Gaylord? Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think definitely is. It's interesting, like you brought up the CD-ROM-ness of that piece, because I kind of thought the same thing. It reminded me in many ways of like the old days of the web, like in the late 90s or the early 2000s, when all the forms weren't yet like we didn't have like a standard format blog post that had the picture on the right, and all the kind of the formats that we all are sort of stuck with now. And in many ways, it's almost like a piece that came out of that. For people who haven't read the piece, if you do a search for Snowfall New York Times, you can get a look at it. And basically, what it's doing is that they're taking elements of video and widescreen, big images, and of course, great typography, and blending it into this story that spreads across 5 or 6 sections, and there's integrated pieces of video. So as you're reading, there's a video chunk that's inserted right next to what you're reading. That's usually about what it is that you're reading. So it's sort of you're going along reading, and then there's a video that might have further information, usually like interviews with people that are in the story that is going on. And that's like on one hand, it's really simple, right? Okay, we embedded some video next to the place in there, but the piece as a whole ends up being really interesting that way. And and I think you're right, like in terms of how does this kind of storytelling can tie into any sort of, I think, process-driven story or that kind of stuff. So
it's sort of the thing that the analogy that I was thinking about is it's sort of like the story wraps around the user rather than the user sort of blankly, consuming the editorial. It's sort of like what the promise of something like the New York Times Magazine in terms of the immersiveness of the content sort of always promised to be, and just to continue on this sort of CD-ROM theme, it sort of reminded me of like that old game Myst. Do you remember that old game? Or Riven was the sequel, you're sort of, you don't really know where the end of the story is going to be, but you're sort of guided through this process where it sort of takes you from, when the avalanche started to, in the middle of it, what it feels like, and then this video, and it sort of wraps around the user based on the context of perhaps where they've been before, and sort of offers up some 2 or 3 paths, almost like a, to get too nerdy about it, but almost like one of those sort of old adventure game books where you would sort of, turn to page 400 to fight the dragon, or turn to page 50 to, pick up the sword, or, that kind of stuff. So I think it was a really interesting, it's a really interesting attempt at sort of the future of what a story can be. I know a lot of people that I follow from the journalism field had points of disagreement with this, like, for example, that kind of thing is very expensive to produce, for example, outside of just sort of straight editorial that you would read with a few pictures alongside it. The actual multimedia-ness of it, it's a lot more time intensive, and there's a lot more heavy lifting that needs to go on the back end. But as a sort of model to wrap experiences around, I thought it was really, really interesting.
This thing is freaking gorgeous, right? I'm amazed at the execution, the team there. It is gorgeous. However, having said that, and maybe it's because I'm an old-fashioned, word guy. I kind of want to ask, both you guys, when you say that the story sort of wraps around the user, right? Look, from me, when I read a good book, the story wraps around me, right? The story wraps around the user. So one of the questions I have here, I think, is how much of it is because of this visuals, and how much of it is because the writing is just awesome, right? I mean, even without any of these pictures, when I'm reading this article, when I'm reading this actual thing that the New York Times, I don't know if it's the staff, I don't know if it's a single journalist, how the words that they put on, I don't know, I guess I feel like it's equally involving. Like, I don't really need the visuals, I don't really need the video, but like I said, it could just be because I'm like an old-fashioned words and book kind of guy. But that's the question. I mean, if the words sucked, I guess it would be a way of putting it. If the writing sucked, could the visuals carry the story, as you say, or is it? And what's really important here, the words?
Yeah, I think it's more integrated. I think you're right that the writing on this is top-notch. I mean, it's the Times to begin with, and they take a lot of pride in good writing. But I think even by their standards, this is a pretty compelling story. But also, all of the bits that they add into it are all pretty good. Like, there really isn't like that was a kind of a weak slideshow. I mean, they have a kind of one of the things I was thinking about with it is not only is just the writing is pretty good on this piece, but they have a lot of beautiful photographs, and they have some really interesting data visualizations around how avalanches work, for example. And all of those pieces are really, it's kind of like they brought their A game to every element on this. And I think you're right, Rob, that if the writing wasn't any good, then the rest of it would have to be, make up for it or whatever. But they just didn't do that, right? And we've talked about that before, like the idea of, being very good doesn't cut it really. Like, you got to kind of bring your A game like all the way through to everything. And I think they're executing kind of on that. Even at the technology level, like the way you scroll through this story and bits of, it's kind of like the whole background of the white page, if you're on the desktop version of this, kind of like drop away, and behind it is imagery of mountains and so on. So that's kind of my take on some of that.
I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I think it's more of a polished balance between editorial and visuals. I mean, if you think about a typical New York Times story, especially online, it's incredibly text-heavy. I think about like the real estate editorial that they have every weekend. It's very long form in comparison to other types of real estate writing that we would read from somebody like Curbed, or even something on like an Inman.com. The actual length and sort of text heaviness of those things is very, very apparent. And even in the newspaper, it's pretty much all text. And I think one of the things that I see the Times wrestling with is how to compete in an increasingly sort of attention-gamed online world, which is more visually driven. So, when they start to compete against somebody like the Huffington Post and their slideshows, or BuzzFeed and the sort of social sharing content generation, the Times is starting to have to compete with those, with the news breaking and news reporting aspects of those kinds of sites. And, I think it was really interesting in terms of like not necessarily sort of imitating the other sites' models, either going after page views with individual slides and slideshows like people do to sort of serve advertisers, or sort of dumbing down a lot of the content for like some of the social sharing sites do. They actually decided to, like you say, they actually decided to say, well, what would the New York Times do if it tried to balance multimedia with killer editorial? And this is sort of like the first instance where we've really seen this kind of stuff come to life. And I think they did a great job of it, but it's sort of been a once-only thing. I mean, one of the very powerful things about somebody like the Huffington Post or a BuzzFeed or any of these sort of larger but more nimble news organizations is that they do this stuff almost on an hourly basis. They're incredibly consistent in their delivery and execution on these things, and that's something that the New York Times is not at the moment. They've done this one thing, and they did some things with the election, where they did sort of interactive infographics. But very often, what constitutes an interactive infographic is basically something that you click on once. It isn't like this sort of immersive experience in the way that the Avalanche story was. So it's sort of interesting times in terms of how those things are sort of positioned. But I know I feel like there's going to be a lot more of those things coming from the New York Times, but I can't really sort of envision a place where that's going to happen, across the board every single day on their website. Like they don't physically have sort of the manpower or the resources to do something at that scale for every single sort of story. They're going to have to really sort of prioritize and choose those things. No?
I actually think about, I think you're right that you couldn't do it on every single story along the way, but they have such a well-developed data graphics staff, and I feel like this snowfall is more of a test run to say, well, what if we integrated our data graphics capability even more tightly with and this is, I kind of look at this as a first run, and I hope we'll see more like this. But I also think that the newsroom could be arranged in such a way that it isn't unusual to see something with this level of integration between the text and the image and the data graphics.
Do you guys see applications for this in terms of brokerage sites, or how do you see this working in the real estate environment, or applications for it?
Well, I think if you take the simple idea of contextually relevant information wrapping around the user as they move from beginning to end point, I think that's essentially the same framework of sort of customer journey, whether that's a real estate process or a retail process or reading an article process. So I sort of see the same approach in place for really quite simple applications for real estate. So say, for example, you're reading something about life in a neighborhood in Houston, for example. It might be that you start to, as a reader, you start to follow a certain thread of information about food in Houston, for example, and then it starts to guide you through all this contextually relevant stuff about the food culture in Houston and where to go and what's good and what's not, and seasonal stuff and things like that. And then once you start to come out of that, then it sort of almost sort of guides you into other content areas that you would naturally get to from that kind of stuff. So maybe like, here's where the grocery stores are, and here's how long it takes to get to them, and things like that. Like, so, I think the idea of a journey of exploration about like a neighborhood or where to live or the things that there are to do in a particular city or something like that, I see that as not really that dissimilar from the structure that was put in place by something like Snowfall. So I think there are very clear applications for the real estate industry if you place the listing in the middle of the experience, and you say, okay, so wrapped around this particular listing is all this other sort of rich stuff. Now, this is something very new to what we do at Corcoran, for example, because we do a lot of this sort of what we call beyond the four walls kind of marketing. But this idea of being able to use that sort of editorial template to explore a neighborhood based on specifically what you were interested in and have that wrap around you as a user.
Don't we see that happening a lot right now, or is the layout of the way this is laid out?
Not to this degree.
Not to this degree. And I think it's really difficult for somebody like a syndicator, right? Somebody that's doing property listings at scale. It's really difficult for them to do this because of the content generation and content problems associated with making the contextual placement of that stuff timely and relevant for the user. If you think about that Snowfall editorial, it's a highly curated experience in terms of what appears where for the user, and that isn't necessarily solved by an algorithm. That's like a person putting that journey in place in the way that an author would. So it's really, really difficult to do at scale, this kind of stuff. But for individual kind of experiences, I think the smaller and leaner types of organizations will be able to do something like that. But they have to have the content in place first to be able to do it. I mean, one of the big advantages of what the Times did is that they had killer editorial, killer photos, killer video, and we're able to sort of assemble all that stuff in a way that made sense for the user. And that's very often the blind spot for folks in the real estate industry is the assembly of all these different things. Like, agents know this kind of stuff, like where all the cool things are in the city, or where to go, or what the process consists of, or advice about a neighborhood and that kind of stuff. But actually assembling it online into one sort of seamless, articulated experience is very often like a massive challenge.
I think my concern is actually exactly what Lindsay and you guys just when you said, which is that there is such a clear application to real estate, except that the way that something like this would be executed in real estate would be awful and horrible. That's my concern. And I think that's kind of
what you're doing it, Rob. But we got to, other people do beautiful things with real estate.
I hear you. Let me finish what I really mean by that. If the Corcoran Group were doing this, I think they could pull it off because they have a guy like Matthew, right, who's talented enough. My concern when something like this gets applied to real estate is that people forget the narrative. So to go back to what I started this with, right? If you've got the words, if you have the story, I'm there. You've wrapped the narrative around me. A lot of times, though, it's all about sort of the newest, coolest gadget or the newest, coolest thing. So I think my concern would be like some vendor out there comes out with some app or some tool that you could take, random videos and photos, and you can create something that looks kind of like what the New York Times did with the snowfall, and not realizing what makes that thing so amazing is not just the technical execution, which is, again, it's fabulous. And the technical execution, the content, as Matthew pointed out, they have killer photos, they have killer videos, but it's also the writer who writes the story is fantastic, right? So I kind of feel like looking at this, I go, this is a work of art, right? What the New York Times produced is a work of art. It is the narrative, like you say, it wraps around, right? It's
not
gorgeous.
An algorithm. It's not solved by an algorithm.
Right.
It's closer to curation and really what an editor does in massaging an author's work around a topic.
No, granted, but the writer who put the words together is not an algorithm, right?
Right.
So I'm likening this to me. I'm kind of like, this would be. Like I said, this is truly impressive. I worry about like the Avatar effect, right? Or what we see coming out of Hollywood, where everyone pays attention to special effects and nobody pays attention to story, right? So yeah, the 3D CGI graphics and the special effects are mind blowing and they're awesome, but I walk out of the movie going, what the hell was that about? That was the worst movie I ever saw, and that would be what I'm afraid of. This being applied to real estate. If they started with a narrative. If there was an agent out there who really knew the story around the house, a neighborhood, a city, an area, or a marketing person who really got the narrative first, and then used the algorithms and then used these types of things, yeah, then it would be fantastic. I mean, could you imagine a listing presentation like, or listing online that looks something like this? Of course.
It would be.
My concern would be
amazing if somebody did it.
It would be amazing. Yeah. My concern is that, at least with respect to how real estate people think about things, they would think more about the tools and the coolness factor and the gadgets and that instead of the narrative.
I think it's easy to say that, but it's not altogether true. We can all name cases where that is true, but that doesn't mean that every person who encounters this technology is going to think that way. I think one of the things I guess I think about when I approach new technologies, or in this case, it's not like there's a lot of new technology in this. It's a different way of assembling stuff online. One of the things to think about is like, well, what's the prerequisites? What are the prerequisites to make this work, right? So just like a person can't just like turn on Facebook and suddenly it works, they need some other things in place in their life for Facebook to work for them. The same thing is true here. But if someone doesn't have a good concept of narrative, because this whole entire piece and all of the technology is all put together in such a way to drive a narrative, if the producer, the agent or the person that they hire to build this for them doesn't have a clear concept of narrative, you're right, it's not going to work. So a prerequisite to making something like this work is that someone's going to have to truly understand narrative, and that's not something that everybody has, but some people will, and some people will hire them. Just like you hire a good difference between getting a good video director and a not good video director. So it does up the game beyond just the technical skills of being able to write well and take good photography and shoot good video, but then to weave all of that together in a narrative sense, it definitely would require that. But I don't think that makes it inherently beyond the reach of the real estate market. I think that's not being generous enough to an entire industry.
If I might answer, I mean, I'm not saying it's inherently beyond. I'm not saying that there aren't going to be folks out there who do a great job with it. Of course there will be. But, I mean, you look at the pattern of technology adoption in real estate. Blogs come out, a few people start doing it because they're bloggers and they're good writers. And then all of a sudden we have webinar after webinar after webinar pushing blogging on every real estate agent, and we end up with 10,000 crap real estate blogs. Look at video. Right. Video first comes out. There are people who have a narrative sense, and they go and use video, and they do amazing things with it. And then again, we have webinar after webinar after webinar, and it becomes like the thing, the magic silver bullet. So all of a sudden, all these realtors out there and vendors start selling, prepackaged video platforms, whatever, and now it's a piece of crap. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that there aren't real estate agents, realtors who really do and could use something like this. Of course there are. There are brilliant, creative people in the industry. I'm just saying my concern with respect to what Lindsay asked about, applying this to real estate. Like I said, do I think Corcoran Group can do this? Absolutely. Do I think that, when some video vendor or some sort of, hey, do the New York Times wall vendor thing, and all you need is $59.95 a month, and your credit card will. I mean, that's what I'm concerned about, and that's a pattern in the industry. That's all I'm pointing out. I agree. There are people who can do this. I would say most people can't.
Yeah, and it's a fairly cynical attitude, I think, Rob. But
yeah, a little bit.
It's not one that I don't necessarily disagree, because I've seen exactly what you are talking about happen, whether it's blogging or video or social or mobile or whatever it is. It happens, and it's not exclusive to the real estate industry in that it does happen. It happens across the board. But one of the things that strikes me is that, you're talking about quite a small subset of real estate content that this can even be applied to. This isn't for every listing in the way that something that would be vendor-centric might be. If it's, if the listing doesn't have that kind of story associated with it, trying to shoehorn content, into the sort of false promotion of a particular listing, that's not going to make sense. But, if it's somebody like a Raj Kassar, for example, out on the West Coast, that he's doing these sort of trophy properties, overlooking the cliffs and the Pacific Ocean and things like that, then, I could see this working really, really well. But I think that, it's not applicable to everything. But one of the things that does strike me about our conversation is that, whether it's video or social or blogging or whatever, you have agents making more things than ever before, and that is something that happens at scale. They're contributing to platforms, and they're doing, Instagram photos and stuff like that. So the ability to pull in things around a listing, that could be possible. The extent to which, what we're really talking about isn't necessarily the automation of and curation of pulling this sort of storytelling stuff in around a listing. What we're really talking about is the quality of the experience that happens after that. It's the agents are making this stuff already, or the marketers in the brokerages are making this stuff already, but it's the specific skill of making that into a sort of a high quality, engaging, unique online user experience. That's the particular skill that hasn't really been sort of explored, and it's a really difficult thing to sell. And that's why I sort of disagree a little bit with the vendor conversation, because I'm not sure that this kind of stuff, as I said before, can be solved by like an algorithm. It needs a person, a highly skilled sort of storytelling producer, director type person to assemble this stuff in a way that's going to make sense for the user and for the listing. And it's not something, that's why I say something that like the syndicators would really struggle to do something like this. Although saying that, I think that what we're seeing, what we were talking about last week with Zillow Digs, the idea of having these sort of immersive tablet-centric experiences, they're on the very sort of slow, tentative path to doing this kind of stuff. It already starts to look a bit like Snowfall inside of that app, for example. But it's the rich, highly curated, unique voice of the content around that listing that's the important thing, and that's where the sort of snowfallness comes in. Is that is a manual process. I think it's very difficult to automate.
And I think one of the advantages that this kind of snowfall presentation has to it is it's pretty captivating. And some of it's because they don't have blinking ads and garbage all over it. But once you start reading it and going through it, at least in my case, and I'm sample size of one, I guess, but I couldn't stop. I started going through it, and I got all the way to the end, and that's it's
a work of art. It's beautiful. It's a work of art.
Yeah. And when I think about, if there is a way to attach that kind of storytelling technique and skill to the real estate conversations, whether it's on a listing individually or on a neighborhood or on the home buying process. I think anything where you can craft a narrative, and people have been saying for years, we've got to focus on story and narrative and stuff, and this is sort of maybe an opportunity for the rubber to hit the road on this one and figure out where really is there, where can we really find a narrative. But it's completely captivating in the way of, like, you don't get on that and then start click, 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 click onto all kinds of other stuff. You're like in that story, and while you're in that story, it provides an advantage, I think, to the agent or broker website that is guiding people through whatever narrative that is. And admittedly, that skill of putting that narrative together, is a human one, and one that, not many people, I don't think, possess naturally, and not many people get the opportunity to exercise. One interesting thing on that, like the narrative and algorithm side, is there's a company called Narrative Science that takes data and makes text out of it. It makes an actual story. And if you read sports scores or sports stories, chances are really good you've already read some of the content they've made. And not that I think that, like, you can grab some Narrative Science, hook up to your data feed and pump out snowfall. But there's a part of me that wonders what areas of blending between all of these different types of media, like we have in Snowfall, between slideshows and video that was produced on site, and audio and text, whether there and data graphics, whether there's also a place for data narrative, in that kind of thing. I don't know. It's just kind of.
Do you think there's a place for something like this, like as a brokerage site experience, rather than maybe for every individual listing or every neighborhood, but maybe like an experience with a broker having their brokerage site look like something?
Yeah, I think what is the process of buying a house with us? If you work with us, what is this narrative like? Because I think that's one of the things people, at least that's what I hear a lot of people talk about. Oh, well, our service is better than the next person's service, because people are trying to figure out how do they differentiate one from the next, and a way of really like captivatingly describing, like, this is how it works when you're working with us, and here's the processes and the steps that we go through, and putting that together in a way that's compelling and captivating, that provides sort of a little bit of relief from the text to go to a little short video clip, back and forth. If you can get someone to spend, as long as it took me to read the Snowfall article, reading through the how is it like to work with you kind of thing, whoever is going to compete against that is up against a pretty stiff, pretty high bar. I would. Yeah, I'm just making that up.
You're dead right, I think, Gaylord. I mean, you used the word several times there. Captivating is really the key word there. In that most digital real estate experiences are not captivating.
Right.
I would argue. Whether that's because of the design experience or the content experience. I think the process of buying a home is captivating. I mean, it completely monopolizes your thoughts when you're actually going through it. So I think the demand is certainly there to create captivating experiences. And I think you're absolutely right to say, okay, Snowfall's sort of where the bar is right now. But the other example that comes to mind for me, and I only say this from personal experience, is children's books on the iPad. They're incredibly sort of immersive and deliberately so, where you're turning the page and it actually feels like you're turning a real paper page. It's just subtle things like that. Or you swipe across the page and the balloons will move, or the flowers will sort of blow in the breeze, or something like that. There's a great one. I forget the name. Let me try and look it up here. There's a great one called. It was done by like a ex-Pixar guy, and it's about books. It's the Fantastic Flying Books of Morris.
Yes, yes, I've read that. Yeah, that's a fantastic book.
It's a fantastic. It's well, I guess you would call it an app rather than a book. Right?
Yeah, I don't know what you call it. It's fabulous though.
It's this amazingly immersive experience, and my daughter has read that book for a good 18 months, and she's only 3. So there's like a piano in one of the pages where you can sort of play along a tune on, and there's things to turn, things to spin, things to
and a lot of really like subtle animations happen in it.
The animation is amazing. Like the actual execution of it, you're dead right. I think wasn't it like a guy that had worked at Pixar and put it?
Yeah. I can't remember exactly, but they've done a lot of product development and stuff. I got into it because I have clients in the children's media kind of world, and so that everyone was talking about it when it first came out. And the guy's got extensive experience in animation and product development, especially.
Right. And I don't think we can sort of level that expectation at agents, but that kind of thing, as executed on for, to Lindsay's point, either a brokerage experience or an individual listing experience, I think would be absolutely fantastic. And it would be captivating. I mean, the Morris Lesmore book is a captivating book. Snowfall is a captivating experience. And, the experience of saying, here's my bedroom count, here's my bathroom count, here's my price and location, now show me 10,000 results. That's sort of the opposite of that, I think. That's the opposite of what we're talking about. But it's so prevalent within the real estate industry, and it's sort of inherently not captivating, I think. Rob?
Well, and it drives the experience towards commodity, right?
Yeah,
once we'll run our structured search on, and there's a certain amount of that has to happen, right? Someone knows what their price range is. They know where they want to live. So balancing that, I think, is always going to be the challenge, in that area.
I think just listening to you guys go through it, you're both exactly right, and I realize it's in line with sort of one of our major themes, right, throughout almost all of our podcasts, right, which is don't get dazzled by by the tools. Don't get overly focused on technology. It's always been about get focused on the core, right, whatever that core is. In this case, I mean, I guess I submit to you that this book, which I'm not familiar with because I haven't bought a children's book.
You should read it. You should read it. It's good, Rob. You'll like it.
I'm sure it's mind-blowing. What I'm wondering, though, is I feel like that book is probably going to be captivating, even if it was just printed on, paper. The Snowfall the story, the story itself is just captivating. And if that were written with quill pens on vellum, I think I would still be captivated by the story. So it's sort of going back to kind of, again, one of our big themes, which is brokers and agents, when they focus on what's really, important, what's human, the narrative or the service element or what have you, that is going to speak, in and of itself. And then the tools and the technology and some of this stuff will come on to enhance that experience. I think, so just putting my own, comments in the context, that's kind of what I was trying to get at. I really do feel like if somebody took a house and just told a story about that house, even in just a plain no pictures blog post, it would be pretty captivating. And I think it would stand out over and above some of the other things we've seen, like Matthew's pointed out, that's just sort of bed bath, and there's no narrative behind it. It's just this commoditized experience, and it doesn't really matter how many videos or how many photos or how many new doodads or QR codes or whatever you surround that commoditized, no story, no narrative, no soul, no spirit thing with. I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at.
So Rob, let me dig a little deeper on what you're saying there.
Sure.
What do you think the barrier is to making those captivating experiences? Why don't we see more of it coming out of the real estate industry? If we all,
I think
it's a great thing, right? We all agree that it's a great thing, and there are examples in the world of what it could be. Why doesn't it happen more?
I think, first of all, narrative and storytelling it's not easy, right? I mean, if it were easy, I think everyone would be a Hollywood film, writer of some sort. I don't think it's easy to do. The second thing, though, I think is that most of the time, when I hear friends of mine who are realtors talk, or when I sort of just participate in their discussions about various issues, I really think that they think of themselves really as salespeople. Right? And when they think of things like marketing, I think most of them have a mindset of what I need to do is promote this. Right? What I need to do is get this in front of as many buyers as possible. I think very few of them actually think in terms of my job as the marketer for this house is to tell a story about this house. That was something I saw a while back. I can't remember. It wasn't done by a realtor. It was done by a person, like an actual seller. And I don't know if it was a physical or if he did it in conjunction with his realtor, but he sort of went through and told the story of his house. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Was it a video?
I can't remember. I almost want to say it was like an actual blog that somebody put up, right? Oh. Where, he went through and basically started talking about, this is when we bought the house and we had our kid and we had this party. Here's pictures from a Christmas party. I mean, he sort of told the story of his house and of his family and of his life there, right? And I thought it was fascinating. It was telling you the narrative of
sort of like,
that house.
Do you know that Google ad, Dear Sophie? You guys know that one?
Yes.
Where it sort of tells the story about this little girl growing up, and it sort of tells it through the language of using Google products, right? So it's like it's done as a series of emails from the father to the future daughter, and it's like here's them taking video and posting it to YouTube. Here's them finding their house and using Street View and Maps. Here's them saving photos to Google Plus or that kind of stuff. But it tells actually very briefly. I think that thing is only like a minute, but it tells the story of this little girl growing up. And like she gets sick in the middle of it, and then you see her doing her ballet recital, and it's like. As a father myself, it's like quite tough to watch, something like that. But it tells the story of this person's life, and I think it's sort of very similar to the kind of thing that you're talking about, where it could be the journey of a property, as opposed to how Google did it with this little girl.
I see something I know that Garen Selican in Portland is making an effort to do this with M Realty. Some of the video, they're really trying to tell stories with their listing. I know that there's a distinct effort on their part to do that. But Matthew, you asked, why don't we see more of this? And I wonder if someone like Gaylord or a small brokerage or larger brokerage is cut out to do stuff like this, but the individual agent, I think the challenge for them, Rob mentioning that they think of themselves as salespeople. Well, yeah, that is part of the role, and I think that the challenge for real estate agents that I'm talking to all the time is the allocation of time, their resources, time, money. Where do you spend time? And I think that I've said this before, I think they're stretched in so many different ways to be an expert in all of these different areas and really do something that is at this high level, even partially at this level, I think is a challenge for the individual agent.
Well, let's not confuse what the individual agent does versus what the individual agent facilitates. Because there's a difference between those two things. I don't think our conversation is about the agent doing this themselves, because we've had that conversation several times on this podcast, that the expectation should not be for the agent to be anything else other than a salesperson. That the agent shouldn't be copywriters and designers and videographers and things like that. But the agent as facilitator of the production of these things, and sure,
but you're still talking about their financial resources at that point, whether it's time or their
of course,
and
of course,
yeah.
and that's why I make a very clear distinction that this isn't for every single listing, of course.
Right.
There's a certain level of listing where this kind of thing is going to be more appropriate, than other types of listings. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And price is obviously one of those things. I think location is probably one of those things as well. But I think that agent as facilitator of those things, sort of almost like the person that directs the traffic to get this stuff made, like a Raj Kassar, for example. I think he's like a really good example of somebody that sort of orchestrates this stuff without actually physically doing it.
Right.
Or, I could certainly say that that's the model here at Corcoran as well. Our agents, there's absolutely no expectation that they would go and film stuff themselves.
And that's what Darren's doing a great job of. Darren's doing a great job of taking that on behalf of his agents, I think.
Right. That sounds awesome.
Wanted to throw in on this is that what we've seen a lot about agent video or just video in general, and everyone's really focused on that, and I think that that's probably a good thing. And I wonder if some of that isn't like related to this kind of rolling all the way back to the idea of captivating. Like once making a good video is like one set of, so you can either hire a good videographer, maybe you're a good videographer, and that's like one skill. And once the web visitor is pressed play, they're on the train tracks and they're theoretically captivated until they get tired of watching the video. Whereas this kind of experience requires a greater degree of orchestration than even just a video would. But that the end result is that the user ends up, the viewer of the content ends up being more involved somehow. Like it's less passive because you are scrolling and clicking and that kind of thing. So I wonder, like at the agent level, I think you're right. It's to expect like one individual to do that. The Snowfall piece has like 16 or 17 people credited in it. So I think no matter what, we're not talking about a single individual. Although the technology itself behind this, I think, is really basic. I mean, it's not crazy tech going on here. It's what it is. It's crazy narrative composition, kind of like what Rob was talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. And whether the agent brings that narrative spark and then hands that off to good content producers, or whether it's some kind of team, I think it's possible. That's all.
No, I think it's definitely possible, and it points out, the two sort of complaints that we have about, the way that the industry is today. Right? One being, it's fine for us to sort of say, look, an individual agent should focus on being the best agent that he or she can be, and leave things like this narrative construction or whatever to people who are better at that. At the same time, you go to any, I don't care which conference, you go to pretty much any real estate conference, you go on Facebook and see what people are talking about, and there's this constant barrage of, you got to do it yourself, right? There's this constant barrage of, hey, here's a tool that will allow you to do your own content creation.
Well, that's a survivor. You have a survivor bias there in that you're surveying a specific population that is online and is noisy. That doesn't mean that that's all the agents in the world. It's just those happen to be the noisy ones in those channels, and the DIY kind of scene kind of tends to aggregate in that way. So while I will agree with you, we go to conferences online, we will definitely see all that stuff, but that doesn't mean that it's actually indicative of reality.
No, I actually think it's not a observer bias, because what I'm talking about is when I go to speak at events, for example, right? So I'll go to some state association event, and at least half of the sessions, if you will, is some guy getting up there telling agents, you need to do this, you need to do that. They're not saying, you be the facilitator, right? You do your thing as an agent, and then go find the right people, to find the right companies, or find the right ways of doing it.
Who's putting that guy on stage? Who's putting that person on stage?
The association, the broker,
right. So then those are the people those are the people, I guess, that want their audience to hear that message.
Oh, right. So I guess what I'm getting at is part of this is what Lindsay was pointing out, that agents are constantly bombarded and they have no time, right? And they're being told all these things, which, again, if all the agents in the United States listen to this podcast, I think most of them would say, yeah, you know what, those guys are right. My time is better spent being a real estate agent, being a really good representative of buyers and sellers, and not being a, quote, content creator or a content curator. You know what I mean? And I think something like this, like Snowfall, I think points to that. And I think that's what's so amazing about it. Again, when you go back to Matthew's question, why doesn't this happen more? Quite frankly, I think it's because they're being told that they have to be content creators instead of being narrative. Maybe that's what it takes. Maybe it's switching the language from you need to produce content to you need to produce narrative. You need to produce stories, right? And if Garen, out at Portland, he's a creative guy. If he succeeds with that, maybe that's the next wave that we'll start to see happen. I would love to see it happen because, like I said, a company like Corcoran, a company like M Realty, there are some great companies that can do a great job with something like this. But maybe it does take some changes in, how like our message getting carried throughout the industry saying, listen, do what you're really good at. And let other people do what they're good at and stop trying to do everything under the sun.
Well, I think, I don't disagree with anything that you're saying, Rob, because I've seen that happen sort of ad nauseum as well. But I think that there's such a democratization of tools, and the way that a lot of those things are positioned is that, you as the agent can now have all of this stuff in your toolbox, in your pocket, on your smartphone, and so it sort of puts the power of production into the agent's hands in a way that's actually very easy to get agents excited about, and then it's backed up with there's a lot of data that goes in behind that says that customers are craving more video, it increases time on site, things of that kind of nature. But I think one of the things that occurs to me is that there's no how can I put this? There's sort of diminishing return on the value of mediocre content. I'm a big advocate of, and we've mentioned this a couple of times in podcasts previous, of what's referred to as the age of excellence, where people don't even see 4 or 3 or 2-star rated things. It's sort of 5-star or obscurity. And the App Store works like this. Facebook newsfeed works like this due to how EdgeRank works. And if your content isn't absolutely stellar, it actually becomes invisible and deliberately suppressed by the platforms on which it's posted. And the reason that we're having a conversation about Snowfall is because it is in that 5-star rated band. And the reason that we're struggling to find examples of real estate videos or real estate content that sort of compares with that is because there is nothing in that sort of 5-star band. However much people might aspire to that or be working towards that, there really is no precedent for that. So I actually think that that's a tremendous space of opportunity. But to Lindsay's point, it isn't solved by an app. It's not something that's algorithmic, and it's not something that you can sort of assemble with one person. To Gaylord's point, about 16, 17 people worked on that kind of stuff. And when we've done like high-end videos for Corcoran, they have a team of people that work on these things. So the idea of the auteur, if you like, single-handedly creating this thing in a sort of, sort of early French cinema kind of way, if you like, I think is a total myth. And I think it's like an incredibly outdated set of solutions that are being proposed to agents and being, unfortunately, consumed at huge scale. And I think that, if you buy into the idea that it's excellence or obscurity, contributing more to the mediocrity is, even if you do it yourself and you feel awesome about it, very often those things don't even get seen, let alone become effective.
And I think, Rob, like one of the things that you said that I think just really, really nails it is this idea of that it's not that the agent has to become a great content producer. It's that they need to, maybe develop the new skill for them to develop isn't learning how to do technology stuff so much as it is learning to identify where's the narrative in this moment. And this moment could be the house itself. It could be the neighborhood. It could be the home buying process. That ability to figure out what that is.
I love that.
Yeah, I think that's that's really empowering at that point. And then from there, maybe they're fortunate enough to work with a brokerage like M Realty up with Garen or at Corcoran, where there's like a team of people to support the taking of that narrative and really blowing it out to something on the scale of a snowfall. Or they develop their own team of people to do that, because that's a more empowering position. Obviously, we're talking about resource expenditure at that point, whether it's at the brokerage level or whatever. But that's a spreadsheet issue. We look at that and say, that house, it does have that great moment in it, but we're not going to make enough money to justify doing a snowfall on it. So move along.
Right. I think if I could just, I realize I can sum up my entire takeaway by referring to Chris Rock. Right? And it's this.
Watch out.
Just because you can doesn't mean it's a good idea to do it. Right? So just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. I think that's it. The democratization of technology will make it possible that you can do something. Doesn't make it a good idea that you should do that thing if your time is better spent doing something else. That would be my takeaway.
Gaylord, actually, do you have a takeaway then?
No, I don't believe in takeaways. I think that it's insulting to the intelligence of the audience. I like to let everybody kind of take from these moments, what they feel.
On that note, we are going to wrap it up, guys. It was a great week this week, and we'll look forward to talking to you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
It's the magic number. 3. Somewhere